Welcome back. It has become a predictable refrain every time there is a mass shooting at a school. Gun control advocates blame the availability of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Gun rights supporters blame violent video games for warping young minds and desensitizing teenagers to violence and to death. And joining us for more are Republican State Representative Julio Gonzalez, psychologist Eddie Renier, and Candy Magnotti, a grief counselor in the Sarasota area. Thank you all for joining us today. And let us set up this conversation by some comments made by President Trump recently after the Parkland shooting. Let's take a look.
I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts. And then you go the further step, and that's the movies. You see these movies, they're so violent, and yet a kid is able to see the movie.
Julio, do you believe or agree with what the president says here in terms of these violent video games particularly being causational to some of the violence that we see?
Well, they're definitely a factor. They definitely influence the culture that we're raised in. They influence the thoughts and the minds of the kids who are playing with it. They also, some of the literature that you were citing in your introduction, they also affect brain development. So there's no question that it is a factor. To what degree and whether it's an actual causative relationship on any one crime, that's a far different question.
Do you agree?
Well, as you said, the American Psychological Association saw an association, a correlation between violent games and violent movies and some violence. However, a better way to look at it is risk factors. No single risk factor is enough to explain the behavior. But if you have multiple risk factors, that is socioeconomic class, mental health, parenting, and other factors may affect what the outcome is, whether it is violence or not. But to just blame video games or movies on violence is probably nearsighted, too nearsighted.
Candy, you deal with a lot of the young people who are dealing with trauma and crisis. What do they tell you?
Well, what I know for sure from working with clients of all ages is that gun violence, and there is a correlation between gun violence and video games, but that is not the only reason why certain things like that we're seeing is happening. Why it's happening is because people are in pain. And children that are experienced or that experience trauma in the household, they are the ones that are more likely to actually go out and do something like we've seen in Parkland. It's a grief and trauma issue. I actually want to move the conversation from mental health. I want us to stop calling it that because it's not a mental health issue. I've worked with people who are mentally ill, and most of them would never hurt another soul. In fact, they're the ones that tend to be abused and taken advantage of in society. So this isn't a mental health issue. This is an emotional pain. This is a grief and trauma issue. And there are studies, specifically the ACEs study, that supports exactly what I'm saying.
You know, I don't know if most people know, but you're not only an orthopedic surgeon, but you're an attorney. And when we have heard the debate on this issue in terms of the mental illness as it relates to guns, there have been people out there saying that you cannot discriminate against the mentally ill on this issue because of varying reasons and because of equal access.
Well, you know, the question, the key word that you use there is discriminate. It depends on the context. Obviously, everybody deserves a chance. Everybody deserves to have an equal opportunity to thrive in life. But like was, I think the consensus of your panel today is, we do believe that there is certain factors that set up certain types of behavior, certain types of problems.
Okay, we are just getting warmed up, and we'll have much more on violent video games right after we check the First Alert weather, so stay with us. Welcome back. We are talking about school shootings and the impact of violent video games on youngsters. And joining us for more are Republican State Representative Julio Gonzalez, psychologist Eddie Renier, and Candy Magnotti, a grief counselor in the Sarasota area. Representative, one of the titans of the conservative judiciary has always been Antonin Scalia. And the Supreme Court back in 2011 ruled on an issue involving violent video games. I want to put Justice Scalia's opinion that he wrote for the majority up on the screen there. He said psychological studies purporting to show a connection between exposure to violent video games and harmful effects on children do not prove that such exposure causes minors to act aggressively, said Justice Scalia, writing for the 5 justices in the majority. Any demonstrated effects are both small and indistinguishable from effects produced by other media. But so often after we have these massacres like Parkland or Sandy Hook, you hear folks like either the president or the NRA zeroing in on violent video games as really causational to this.
You have to be careful in how you parse a legal opinion, because the standard for proof there is very different than the standard of proof or the standard of opinion that people would have at another arena. So that being said, I think I can relate and understand where the justice is coming from. However, I think the literature, as you have discussed previously, is mixed. But I think there is a gelling, there is a coming of a consensus that demonstrates that there is an association between aggressive behavior, aggressive thoughts, maybe degrees of unhappiness, particularly in teenagers, and correlating that with participation in violent video games. There's also other factors that are not maybe directly related, things like lesser of an ability to engage in social skills and social interaction. We used to go out and play ball down the street. Now you're kind of looking at a screen. So although that opinion legally is probably still sound, I think as the literature has evolved, I think there's a gelling, that there is some correlation there.
I realize, Doctor, that you're going to find research that shows anything to anybody, but there was another piece of research I wanted to point out. It's from USC, and a researcher there saying, quote, researchers find that people serving time for violent crimes typically consume less media before committing their crimes than the average person in the general population. When it comes to video games, the overwhelming majority of kids who play do not commit antisocial acts.
True. Justice Scalia's opinion is as true today as it was then, and I sort of disagree. I think that an association or correlation doesn't mean causation, and the studies certainly show that some people, a minority of people, are affected by video games, but the majority, vast majority, have no ill effects. And of the people who commit violent acts, when we look at them, we find out that they suffer from mental disorder, they have addictive problems, they have bad homes, they have violence in the home, lots of other risk factors. So when in view of looking at the basket of risk factors that such people present, it is difficult to then say this one is the cause of it. In fact, we can't make that conclusion.
I'd like to really move the conversation a little forward, though, because I feel like we've heard this over and over again. When a shooting happens, we want to find a reason to blame. And in reality, what blame is a way to just discharge pain and discomfort. And the reason that we blame is because we're trying to get a sense of control in a very vulnerable, uncontrollable world. And the inverse of blame is actually accountability. And nobody really wants to take accountability for what's happening in our society.
In what way?
In what way is that this is not, it's easy to say it's mental health, or it's video games or violence. Yes, that's easy ways to blame, but in reality what's happening is these children, these men, these boys who are picking up a gun and going to school and shooting people is because they are in deep emotional pain. They are in grief. They've experienced a litany. I could give you a whole list of different traumas that they've experienced, which does change how the brain develops, okay? So it's a societal issue. We all have to take responsibility and accountability here.
Let me put it this way. I mean, but part of it is, it is a political discussion, and it's going to be politics in terms of the laws that we pass that will or will not solve the problem. The fact is, what you're talking about is, it happens all around the world in all sorts of countries. There was another story that I read today who said that In Japan, you have very violent video games, but you do not have gun-related massacres like we saw just a few weeks ago because, Representative, the availability of the guns is not there.
Well, that varies between cultures and it varies between societies. But let's clarify a few things. First of all, the gelling within the literature about the association with aggressive behavior and exposure, lots of exposure to violent video games is there. There's a 2014 meta-analysis, 2,900 studies that were compiled, and the literature was reviewed in a very scientific manner, and it did demonstrate that there was, number one, more aggressive behavior on the part of children who participated in violent video games, and number two, there was more positive behavior, more empathy amongst children who participated in socially promoting games. So from that standpoint, yeah, there is definitely a correlation, whether it's causative in any one particular case or not. That is a different discussion, but there's no question that it's related.
So, Eddie, you know, many times the answers are not either or. It's a lot of combination of different things. But you know, you're the psychologist here. If we banned these ultra-violent games, would we see fewer school shootings like we just saw?
Absolutely not. Yeah. I think that politically we're looking for an scapegoat, an easy solution to a very complex problem. Another way to look at it is that the kind of school violence we see happens because people have access to these terrible weapons, these assault weapons, that a kid should be able to easily buy an assault weapon and go to school and shoot a bunch of people. It's an easy, if you want to not discuss the weapons, to discuss video game causing violence. Video games certainly, no matter how much association with a video game, no video game playing has ever caused one life. But grabbing guns and shooting them has caused lives. And so let's not talk about the guns, let's talk about video games. And the studies that we were just talking about, in fact, many of them are methodologically flawed. And that's why the American Psychological Association said there is an association in watching video games and some imitation of violence in some people, but not all.
But you know, if you go a little farther above this conversation, what you'll see is happening is all we're doing is blame shifting. That's all it is. What we need to do is get to the real root of the problem.
But the people who are watching this tonight, it seems like our society is lost in terms of what to do. There is no consensus, and we're looking, whether it's the science or our politicians, to help form a consensus. And I'm not saying this is an either-or approach, but obviously, Julio, the doctor is saying that, you know, and we have talked about the gun issue on this show, but you know, if you could respond to what the doctor was saying in terms of the one thing that's common in these massacres, which are the guns.
I'm going to agree in part and disagree in part. First, I agree that it is a far stretch to say that playing video games will cause a violent crime. I will disagree in the statement that no video game ever caused a child to go out and imitate cross the threshold from virtual reality to real reality and perform a violent crime. I think that's a stretch. But the reality is really this. It is multifactorial. It is a factor. When we talk about issues of grieving and having difficulty with pain and coping with pain and coping with life stressors, there's no question that if we are raising our kids in an environment where they are focused on things that are either antisocial in nature and recurrent in exposure, there's no question that they're going to have more difficulty with grieving and with dealing with their stressors. Whether that leads to any particular crime, that's a different story. But I do believe firmly that it is a factor amongst many that is leading to some of the social demise that we're seeing today.
We have to leave it there. But FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. And for the latest on local breaking news, don't forget to download the updated version of our app. If your current app doesn't work, it's expired. Just go to the App Store and re-download it by searching for WWSB or My Suncoast. We want to thank all our guests for being here tonight. Republican State Representative Julio Gonzalez, psychologist Eddie Rainier, and Candy McNally, a grief counselor in the Sarasota area. When we return, we'll be joined by Michael Snipes, an economics professor at USF Sarasota Manatee, who will be here to discuss the thousands of tariffs announced by President Trump. Stay Stay with us.